SEC offseason means recruiting full-time. We'll talk the nation's #1 class. Guess who? As we eye February 4th, that first Wednesday, of course, of February, National Signing Day. A never too early forecast for 2015. Who's on the ascent? Who's on the descent in the conference? And a fair, honest, objective look at SEC football performance in 2014. What are all these numbers behind me? Mark Rogers TV, the mad scientist, goes to work in just a few minutes. This is the SEC in 60. You can join us right here on Google Hangouts live every Monday at noon Eastern Time and 11 Central Time. Again, live on Google Hangouts if you want to see the live show. Then it's uploaded to YouTube. So just a couple hours after that, the video is uploaded to YouTube, and it's also at markrogerstv.com. And we've got the SEC available to you on podcast. And again, it's later in the afternoon every Monday. You can catch us on Podbean or also upload it at iTunes. Just search out Mark Rogers TV or the SEC in 60. And we're joined in just a few minutes by Joe Lisi, who's just jumped on the line. And we'll get to Joe in just a second. You can also join us each and every weekday at 2 o'clock Eastern and 1 o'clock Central on the SEC Fans Radio Network. So just type out SECRadioNetwork.com. Catch us right there on Dr. SEC's platform. And also follow us, of course, on Twitter and also on Facebook at Mark Rogers TV. We'll talk up some college football, not just the SEC. We do all of college football, but this is dedicated to SEC football, 60 full minutes. And even though the SEC's been off the field for a couple weeks, we are going strong. Let's knock out some news and notes before we get to Joe. We've got Vanderbilt quarterback Stephen Rivers, the brother of San Diego Chargers quarterback Phillip Rivers, has announced that he has granted, the school has granted his release from Vanderbilt. It really never worked out their last season, even though he got a shot at the starting job. If you remember, just a couple of years ago, he was the backup to Zach Mettenberger before he got nicked up a little bit, underperformed in fall practice, and Anthony Jennings passed him by. But he was actually one play away from being the LSU starter at one point. Transferred to Vanderbilt, and without Curtis Samuels there, looked to have a great shot at gaining the starting position. But, yeah, 25 of 63, 334 yards, that Vanderbilt offense, a disaster last season under Derek Mason, of course. They've got Johnny McCray coming back as a freshman off his freshman season, 51%, 9 touchdowns, 8 picks. He's the kid with the gun. Then you've got Pat Robinette, who got some valuable playing time in 2013 when, remember, Vanderbilt was actually coming off back-to-back 9-4s in 2012 and 13, and Robinette had to fill in for Curtis Samuels down the stretch. He's the runner. He did well that season, but last year, yeah, he completed 64% of his passes, 3 touchdowns, 3 picks. He's the runner, so that seems to be the quarterback battle for the Commodores as they try to get some respect back under Derek Mason. 0-8 in the SEC in most of those games, not even close. Got some interesting recruiting news out of Auburn. We know what the Ohio State quarterback situation is. They've got a few around that are pretty decent. And they also had a commit from 5-star quarterback Torrance Gibson, who's actually listed as an athlete but wants so dearly to play quarterback at the next level. He's the 16th ranked overall player, according to ESPN. #1 quarterback, depending on your service. He visited Auburn over the weekend, and again, he's been a pretty firm commit to Ohio State, but we know what the situation at quarterback is there, and he had a lot of good things to say to ESPN after his visit with Gus Malzahn and company. A lot of it didn't make a whole lot of sense. He was a bit contradictory here because after the visit he said, "I'm committed to Ohio State, but I'm considering Auburn a lot." When you make a commitment, you're considering somebody else a lot. I don't know what that really means. He doesn't have a problem redshirting, he says, but he can see where at Ohio State it could be 2-3 years down the line before he's given significant playing time. That could be a big issue, and I really don't see any way around it for the Buckeyes because we know what they've got at quarterback. He loves what Gus Malzahn is able to do in developing quarterbacks like Cam Newton and Nick Marshall in just a year or two, so he's thinking, hey, what can he do with me in 3 years? And he's already thinking 3 years in the NFL on down the road. The Ohio State situation, and this may affect the SEC as well, with Braxton Miller, the kid who won 24 consecutive games at Ohio State, who is two-time Big Ten offensive MVP, set all kinds of records there in Columbus. He's been linked to LSU, Duke, Florida State, Oregon, Michigan, all over the place. I would think that LSU would be a tremendous fit for Braxton Miller if he wants to win. Maybe not developing himself for the NFL. That may be a Duke commitment for him might be the best way to go with David Cutcliffe down there. But in regards to winning big football games, setting himself up for that and finishing a fine college career, Braxton Miller might want to consider Ohio or LSU. Of course, J.T. Barrett and Cardell Jones, they're entrenched at Ohio State, and Torrance Gibson, the #1 rated athlete coming out of high school, looking at Auburn now after committing to Ohio State. Auburn had a big weekend on the recruiting trail elsewhere with several five-star prospects showing up. Byron Cowart, according to ESPN, he's their #1 player. He really loves Auburn. New defensive coordinator Will Muschamp makes him feel at home. He had good things to say there. He's considering Auburn, Florida, and Florida State. He says he knows where he's going. He just doesn't want to pull the trigger and announce it as of yet until the day. Cowart's a defensive end out of Sefner, Florida. And again, he had a big weekend at Auburn, says he loves it down there. And he likes the aspect that most of the people on staff there at Auburn played football there. So he knows that if football at the NFL level doesn't work or is a short-lived career, that he can possibly go back to Auburn and find a home there. And then finally, before we get to Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com, saw some comments made by Steve Spurrier, South Carolina head coach, concerning his defensive situation. The Gamecocks were flat out awful. They 3 times blew 2 touchdown leads in the fourth quarter in finishing 7-6, 12th in the SEC in scoring defense, 13th in total defense. And he's saying that he may or may not add a defensive coach to his coaching staff. He doesn't think it's that urgent, and if he really feels a need, I don't know what's going to change between now and spring camp, but he's possibly looking at somebody, but he's not going to commit to anything. His defensive coordinator, Lorenzo Ward, of course, with guys like Chas Sutton and Kelsey Quarles, and Jadeveon Clowney, had a top-flight defense for his first 2 years as defensive coordinator after he took over for Ellis Johnson. This defense just plummeted. 14 sacks in 13 games last season. And, we set you up with that with a number of previews with Connor Tapp of 24/7 Sports about South Carolina's inflated #9 ranking entering last season without that defensive front and Victor Hampton and Jimmy Legree at quarterback, that it would be a tumble from the top of the SEC, and it sure was. All right, let's talk some SEC 2015 and give you a way too early look across the conference and who could possibly be the contenders in addition to the usual suspects. We bring in Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. Joe, how are you?
I'm doing with withdrawal symptoms start to set in. We're a long way off from August, aren't we?
It really is. I say it all the time. If you watch the NBA, Major League Baseball, even the NFL, if you're into any other sport, the windows, it's pretty tight. 3-4 months and you're back into it. But with college football, wow. First week of January, then you're looking at the last week of August. You're looking at basically just like 8 months of nothing. And I know we've got recruiting, we've got spring games, and I talked about it last year. I was all set to watch a bunch of spring games because I thought, man, finally some college football. Then it's not really college football. So it's a rough 8-month stretch. So Joe Lisi joins us each and every Tuesday night during the college football season to break down not just the SEC, but the entire top 25 across the nation and give his predictions. So, Joe, before we dive into who possibly could stand out in 2015, what is your assessment of SEC football in 2014? Because I think it was pretty well established there for, I would argue, not as long as a lot of SEC fans think, but for the last 5 or 6 years that this was the best conference, and it may still be, and looks to the future to be based on the recruiting rankings and the way the trends are working. But for this specific season, just 2014, how good do you think this conference played?
I think overall the conference was in the middle of the pack, Mark. I think when you look at it, really decimated by the quarterback play from 2013 to 2014. You could look at a lot of quarterbacks in 2000. Murray, A.J. McCarron, Zach Mettenberger, Johnny Manziel, James Franklin, Jordan Rogers from Vanderbilt. The list goes on and on. I think what you saw in 2014 was teams starting the year with a new, inexperienced quarterback as opposed to 2013 where there was experienced quarterback play. I think that that's what you saw on the offensive side of the ball from the SEC teams, and I think that that's why the overall record and dominance wasn't there past season, but I think that the SEC is still a strong conference. I think it's still the best conference in college football from top to bottom, and I think in 2015 we'll see that sort of take off from the recruiting last year. But I think what you saw this past season was a drop-off in quarterback play from top to bottom within the conference.
So you're basically saying that the performance in 2014 was pretty much mid-level if you look at the Power 5, but you expected in 2015 to be top to bottom the best conference again.
The reason why I feel that way, Mark, is because of the recruiting that has gone on the last few years. I mean, prior to this championship game with Ohio State and Oregon, SEC sent 8 straight teams to the national championship team. Teams like Alabama, teams like LSU that got top 5 talent across the board, teams like Georgia, they're loaded depth-wise, and that will continue. I think you'll see the effects of Ohio State's big past season 2 to 3 years down the road from top to bottom in terms of the Big Ten, but I think this year coming forward in 2015 is still a solid year for the SEC, and in terms of quality play in teams, I think 2015 will be an up year for the SEC.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. If you look at the recruiting rankings, they can be a bit skewed. There is obviously a whole lot of projection there. Just go back 4 or 5 years. Grab your favorite recruiting service, look at their top 50, 100 players, and half the guys you've never heard of, or maybe a third of the guys. Some of them turn out to be superstars or at least impact players, and then some others are just contributors, and then some just vanish into oblivion. But if you look at large groups of numbers, they typically tell the story. There's a reason Alabama, LSU, Ohio State, and others are at the top of the rankings just about each and every year because they're at the top of the recruiting rankings. So they do tell a story, and the SEC pretty much triples the Big Ten and the ACC, and they're probably the nearest competitors, maybe the Pac-12. The last I've looked, it's been the Big Ten and the ACC, the nearest competitors, and they triple the amount of top-level talent that those conferences recruit. So that's going to spell itself out. I don't think there's any question about that. And the resources, the money given to coaches that attract the top coaches to the SEC, that's not going to go away anytime soon. Joe, I'm going to introduce you to my little math project back here. So try to follow me and see if this makes sense to you or if I need to tweak the system. So I'm going to do this with every conference. And I'm not trying to project into 2015. I'm just taking 2014. How did the conferences perform and who performed the best on the field? So I'm going to forget SEC perception as the best prior to 2014 or anything else. This is just results on the field. So I just took non-conference play within the Power 5. So no other games counted. I know when Florida beats East Carolina or South Carolina defeats an East Carolina or Ole Miss Boise State, I know that means a whole lot. Those teams are good. That should be taken into account. But it was kind of a closed experiment here, so I wanted to stay within the Power 5. So you got the SEC playing 22 games against the other Power conferences. They played 22 games. They won 11-11. I don't know if you can see these numbers. They won 11-11.
I can.
And So the SEC in those games, their win percentage, their record was 95-50, and their in-conference record was 48-42. So if you added up those 11 games that they won, That's what the SEC record was amongst those teams. And they played teams that were, if you take out those 11 wins, almost identical in terms of overall record, the teams that they played. So it was a pretty fair fight. But they played teams with a really good conference record in the 11 games that they won, 54-40. So this number here is their seeding. So I seeded everybody in Power 5 football. I seeded within the conference. So Alabama was 1, Missouri was 2, and I know a lot of people don't think Missouri was the second best team in the SEC, and I get that. But if you look at the conference record, they're the second best team at 7-1 and even 7-2 with the championship game loss. So I seeded everybody, and if there was a tie within the conference, I went head-to-head, and then I went with overall record. So I seeded everybody in Power 5 conferences. And so the average seeding in these games for the SEC was 7.1, so they were actually playing up a little bit and defeating those 11 teams who had an average seed in their conference of 6.3. Okay, I think this tells us a pretty good story here, Joe. In the losses, the 11 losses, so the SEC went 5-6 in the regular season against the other Power 5, and they went 6-5 against the other major conferences in bowl play. Okay, these are the losses, the 11 losses. The teams that the SEC played were 111-37. You know, there was Ohio State and Wisconsin and TCU and a lot of really good teams, and I think this bears it out right here. The average seeding that the SEC was playing in their losses was only a 3.7, so they were playing the upper echelon. That's who they were losing to, if that makes sense. And then what these little figures down here mean is that I had to start with some kind of standard. So I gave a +10 for any win and ±10 for any loss for that conference. And then I tweaked it based on seeding. So, for example, Ohio State beats Alabama. They're both 1 seeds. So that's 10 for the Big Ten, and that's a -10 for the SEC. But in the example of Bama beats West Virginia, Bama's the 1 seed in the SEC. West Virginia is the 6th seed in the Big 12, so that's a 5-seed difference. So I take 5 off of that 10. That means that's a +5 for the SEC, and that's a -5 for the Big 12. And so that plus 11.7 average means that the SEC averaged beating higher seeds, or that would have been, if that would have been seed beating seed on an even playing field, that would have been a 10. So they actually beat higher seeds. This actually means that they lost to seeds higher than them. So it really bodes well for the SEC, despite being 11-11, which I think is pretty marginal. And I don't think the conference was what it's been. Their seeds were typically, if you run down the games, they usually beat higher seeds and lost to higher seeds for the most part. Throw out the big aberration, Mizzou loses to Indiana. That turned out to be a -21 because that's an 11 seed difference plus the 10, so they got hit with a -21 there. So does that make any sense to you, Joe?
It does, Mark, and I agree with you. I think when you look at 2014 as a whole, down year for the SEC, I mentioned the quarterback play, but the defense as well. Defenses were not as solid as they were in 2013. You can look at Alabama entering the year. Prior to 2008, Alabama wasn't negative in turnover margin under Nick Saban. This year, entering that game against Ohio State, they were still at a -1 in turnover margin, very uncharacteristic of a Kirby Smart or Nick Saban type of team. You saw it in games from top to bottom. The SEC wasn't as dominant defensively. You could chalk that up to a number of factors. You look at a team like LSU, within 2013, sent 11 players to the NFL, mostly on the defensive side of the ball. Guys like Eric Minter, their linebacker, Kevius Mingo, and Sam Montgomery. Those are 4-star players that left that team in 2012. They make up for that in 2013. Last season for LSU, Zach Mettenberger, Jeremy Hill, Odell Beckham Jr., Jarvis Landry on the offensive side of the ball. The type of NFL talent that the SEC as a conference sends to the next level is unprecedented. I think that's another reason why you saw a drop-off in the conference play last year. But still, we mentioned the recruiting. top to bottom, still the best conference in terms of top 10 recruiting, and I think that you'll see the effects of Ohio State's victory in a couple of years. You'll start to see the Big Ten challenge the SEC in the next couple of years because parity is in college football. Make no mistake about it. Any team can be knocked off on any given Saturday.
Well, it was actually fun to watch New Year's Eve and New Year's Day because of that, and I agree with most of that, Joe. I believe because of the Harbaugh move to Michigan, because of what Urban Meyer's doing at Ohio State, Michigan State's never going to have quite the elite talent, but Mark D'Antonio has proven that he's an exceptional coach. And, if he's going to go to the Rose Bowl and win and beat another top 5 team, he's now beaten Georgia, TCU, Stanford, and Baylor in consecutive years in bowl games, that he's got it well entrenched there at Michigan State. I think the elite of the Big Ten, it's going to be fun to watch over the next few years. It's going to challenge the SEC, but I think it really drops off for the Big Ten after that. You don't have the Tennessees. You don't have the Arkansas hanging around at that next tier or below that are really strong football teams. And I think we saw it in the Tennessee-Iowa matchup where the Vols were much more talented and just a better football team. So I don't know that the Big Ten's going to challenge top to bottom, but I think that top 3, and with Penn State jumping in there possibly in the next couple of years under James Franklin, it could be really fun to watch. Hey, Joe, who do you like for 2015? Do you see any kind of surprises and anybody that could jump up?
Well, I think will be there due to the recruiting by Nick Saban. Quarterback issue will be the question mark. Will Lane Kiffin stay or will he go to 49ers like some of the reports are mentioned? So we'll have to see how that plays out. Jacob Coker, the Florida State transfer who challenged Blake Sims in the spring, is possibly the starter entering 2015. So eyes on Alabama. You look at a team like Georgia. Hudson Mason moves on. Will Ramsey be the guy? This is, I think, an ideal fit, Mark. Not a lot of people talking about Braxton Miller going to Georgia, but Georgia's another fit that I really think if Braxton Miller wants to take his talents to, he can compete for a national championship. You look at a team like LSU with a new defensive coordinator and Kevin Steele, John Chavis moving over to Texas. Big question mark. How will the LSU Tiger defense respond with a new defensive coordinator? But I'm very high on what Tennessee and Boone's is doing. Joshua Dobbs, very young quarterback, came on later in the season, and offense and defensive lines were the question mark entering this past season in 2014. They were the only team that had to replace all the starters on the offense and defensive lines. They seem to really gel at the end of the year, and Tennessee is a team to watch in the East. South Carolina, I think they were decimated due to 3 straight 11-win seasons, had a lot of inexperience on the defensive side of the ball. They have another year under their belt. I expect Steve Spurrier and that staff to challenge for the East title. I think the SEC East is loaded entering 2015 with teams like Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, Missouri. I think it's going to be a great year, but those are the teams that I'm looking at. I think Georgia could compete if they get quarterback play from Ramsey or another quarterback to step up. That's a team I really like for 2015.
Yeah, Tennessee for a couple of years prior to this season really stockpiled wide receivers and secondary play and elite guys at both positions, and we saw that. You mentioned the issues coming into 2014 along the offensive and defensive lines, but throughout the year they improved. They played much better. They started to win some more significant games in the SEC, and then we saw what they did to Iowa, a team that's comparable with them in another conference, and they just decimated Iowa in the bowl game. Yeah, I think the Vols are going to be really strong. Of course, we saw what Arkansas did down the stretch. Another year from Brandon Allen coming back. They lose some defensive talent that really spearheaded that team and played well down the stretch. Darius Philon has enrolled early for the NFL draft, so they lose some defense, and that defense was so good down the stretch with the back-to-back shutouts. We saw what they did to Texas in the bowl game. That Arkansas group was serious. Wow, the best 7-6 team in the country, the best 2-6 team within the conference. They were really good. I don't know that they can take the leap that people are projecting because, again, the personnel losses on defense are going to be difficult to deal with. But they got the two-headed monster at running back and, of course, Hunter Henry, one of the best tight ends in the country. So that's going to be interesting to see. Joe, before we let you go, what are you working on these days?
Just getting ready for NFL draft, breaking down some player profiles, and just keeping it, getting ready for spring practice, Mark. Always busy for college football.
And I got to ask you before I let you go, because you shook me out of my chair there for a second, mentioning that Braxton Miller, Georgia. Now, is that something that you've heard, or are you just throwing that out as a good option for the kid?
I wrote an article about it. I think it's a good option. I mean, he's mentioned that he wants to go to LSU, and I think LSU statistically one of the passing offense in the conference. But you look at the defensive side of the ball. If he wants to compete for a national championship, I think it's going to be a year or two before LSU rebounds defensively with Kevin Steele. You're talking about a solid defense coordinator, John Chavis, who now moved on to Texas A&M. It's not going to be just an easy fix transition-wise. I think it's going to take a year for Kevin Steele to get acclimated with the talent, and I think LSU won't be as dominant defensively as they were under John Chavis. If you're looking for a team that has a solid offensive and defensive personnel, look at Georgia. 4 or 5 of the offensive starters on that offensive line come back. Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, wide receivers like Malcolm Mitchell, Isaiah McKenzie, Justin Scott Wesley. The only thing that they're missing offensively, Mark, is the quarterback with Ramsey, who really didn't get a lot of experience following Hudson Mason. Defensively, Jeremy Pruitt led one of the best defenses in the country. They get a lot of talent back defensively for the Bulldogs. Why not Georgia? I'm shocked why he's leaning so much to LSU and Cam Cameron as the offensive coordinator.
Well, I think there's either an issue or a benefit, depending on how you look at it, with Braxton Miller going to either LSU or Georgia, 2 of the remaining pro-style offenses. So if he wants to prepare himself for the next level, he needs to change his game, possibly to a certain extent, although the read option, of course, making its way into the NFL. So he's going to have a style or a concept mindset change that he's going to have to deal with in deferring to Leonard Fournette or Nick Chubb as the primary running back. Until Carlos Hyde emerged, he was basically the running back at Ohio State to a certain extent, especially his first full starting season in 2012. So there's going to be an adaptation that he's going to have to make to the style of offense. But at the same time, that's going to prepare him better for the NFL in terms of taking the snap from center, dropping back to pass, play action, the whole deal, and working in some read option, because obviously those concepts have made their way even into the likes of Alabama, LSU, and Georgia, traditional pro-style attacks. If he wants to learn from possibly the best in the business, he surrounds himself with a little lesser talent, and he goes to Duke and learns under David Cutcliffe. But it's going to be interesting either way, because, wow, whoever gets him gets a kid with a ton of raw skills who's basically a running back who has quarterback skills that are a tad raw, but still he's started for 3 years and he's accomplished a lot. He's got a cannon. He's got incredible talent. He's just not quite ready for the NFL.
I agree with you, Mark. And the one burning question I have is, does he have that burning desire to win a national championship after watching his Ohio State Buckeyes trounce all over Oregon on January 12th? If that's the case, I'm not so sure Duke is the right place to go. That's why I'm saying if he wants to win a national championship, Georgia's a team that's going to be competing, LSU as well, but the question mark that I have with LSU is on the defensive side of the ball. John Chavis was a big part of that defense. Now with Kevin Steele, I understand he was the linebacker coach at Alabama, but still his first year as defensive coordinator takes a while till you understand the talent and personnel of that team. Jeremy Pruitt made a dramatic turnaround in Athens last year.
All right, Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. Follow him on Twitter. Look up his website. He's got some amazing college football stuff. I always go to this guy if I want the landscape across the country, the top 25 games, and the rundown top to bottom. So, Joe, always appreciate the time. You have yourself a good week, man.
You too, Mark. Love talking college football with you.
All right. Again, Joe Lisi, goforthe2.com. We're going to move on to Stephen M. Smith of Touchdown Alabama to talk some Alabama recruiting. We're going to talk Lane Kiffin's possible move to the San Francisco 49ers. Also, Stephen M., I want to introduce to you my little science project over here, little math problem that I worked out trying to size up these conferences and get to the bottom of the performance for 2014. So how are you, Stephen?
Doing
Hopefully, Stephen's going to be able to work out some issues. We can't hear you, Stephen M.
I said I'm doing well, Mark. Great.
Hey, Stephen M., we really don't have you there. Do us a big favor, jump off, and then reconnect, and we'll see if we can get a better connection with you, and we'll do it that way. And in the meantime, I will wow everyone with the big board back here. We'll talk the SEC performance in 2014. So again, what I did, and you can check out the video where I run it down, and I'm going to go through the ACC and the Big Ten and the Big 12 and the Pac-12. So I went through the performance for 2014 against the other Power 5 conferences. And Stephen M., you can just let us know when you've reconnected, and hopefully we can secure that connection. So the SEC won 11 games against the other 4 conferences. And if you just look at the seeding, again, I seeded these teams within the conference because it should matter that a first-place team defeated a 10th-place team. That shouldn't count as much as defeating a first- or second-place team from another conference. And also what kind of catapulted me, encouraged me to look at the seedings was that last weekend against the ACC, in which the SEC took on 4 teams from the ACC. They lost all the games, and really the Georgia Tech game was the only comparable matchup. The other ones were not comparable seeded matchups. And so let's go through the losses, because you got Ohio State a 1, defeated Alabama a 1, Wisconsin a 3, defeated Auburn a 6. What do you do with Notre Dame? What's Notre Dame, like a 5 or 6 possibly in another conference, because they're not in a conference, so you can throw them kind of hypothetically in the ACC and give them a seeding. Hey, Stephen M., you with us?
I'm right here. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. What's going on today?
Doing well. I'm really enjoying the little math project you got right here.
So I don't know if you got a chance to follow me on this, Stephen M., but let me explain it to you. So I like to do this every off season, but this is the first time I've gotten quite this scientific. I usually break down the numbers and then I just kind of talk about them and try to give some perspective on what really happened between the Power 5 conferences. But this season, I tried to break it down to kind of a math problem to see if I could come up with a final statistic to give some kind of measurement to performance on the field. So we all know what we think based on the eyeball test, but this is just based on hard, fast results on the field. So the SEC wins 11 against the other 4 conferences, and they lost 11. So that's the bowl games and the regular season. So unfortunately, again, it would become a little bit too cumbersome and difficult to work the math if I included the Mountain West and the MAC and the other conferences. But I don't think that should be dismissed, but we're just keeping this as a closed experiment here within the Power 5. So the SEC wins 11, they lose 11. These are the wins. The SEC teams that won those 11 games went 95-50, and their opponents from the other conferences went 84-59. So that's really comparable, especially if you consider if you take out the 11 wins, it's almost exact. So they almost played the exact record in those 11 wins, and they won all 11 of those games. So that bodes well for the SEC in this experiment. Those SEC teams were 48-42 in the conference. They were playing teams that went 54-40 in their conferences. And again, even though those teams were a little bit higher ranked or seeded in their conferences, the SEC won all 11 of those games. So this right here is a seeding average. So the 11 teams that won those games in the SEC were an average seed in the SEC of 7.1, and they defeated an average of a 6.3. And if you caught the explanation of the 11 losses, I think this is really where it shows that the SEC played some really good football teams, and it's easy to see. You know, if you just run through the losses, you know, Ohio State, a 1 seed, beat Bama, 1 seed. Wisconsin, a 3, beat Auburn, a 6. Notre Dame, it's difficult to seed them because they don't play in a conference, but give them like a 5 seed if you look at where they would have placed in the ACC. Defeated LSU, which was a 7. I know the 2 Mississippi schools, or I'm sorry, Mississippi State and Georgia lost to Georgia Tech, but no shame there. Georgia Tech, a 2 out of the ACC. Mississippi State and Georgia would be the 3 and the 4. Everybody jumped all over the SEC when Ole Miss got annihilated by TCU. But again, Stephen M., we got to consider TCU's the 1 or the 2 seed in the Big 12, and the Ole Miss Rebels a 5 seed out of the SEC. So really the one loss that looks really bad is, of course, that Indiana game against Mizzou. You got the 13 seed out of the Big 10 over the 2 seed in the SEC. But otherwise, these are very understandable losses. Florida State's a 1. Florida's an 8 seed. You know, Louisville's a 4. Kentucky's a 13. Oklahoma's a 4. Tennessee's a 10. Clemson's a 3. South Carolina's an 11. So almost every game, it's very understandable why the SEC lost those games. They were playing higher seeded teams in other conferences, and I think that shows up right there. Your thoughts, Stephen M.?
It really shows up, and I like the way you're treating it, kind of a college basketball bracketology March Madness subject right here.
Yeah, so what the numbers are down here is I had to start with a base. So my base number was you give 10 points for a win, you subtract 10 points for a loss, a negative 10. So what is the quality of win for the SEC? Well, the average would be 10. Like if you were always playing a like-seeded team in another conference and winning those games, you'd get 10 points for all those. But I think you heard me possibly mention to Joe Lisi that, for example, Alabama beat West Virginia. So that was a 1 defeating a 6. So that's a difference in 5 seeds. So we take out 5 points and we give the SEC 5 points for that game. Let's look at the most extreme example. You had Wisconsin, or you had LSU defeat Wisconsin. Well, LSU's a 7 seed in the SEC. They defeat Wisconsin, a 3 seed. So that's a 4 seed difference in favor of the SEC. So you give the 10 points plus 4. So that's a plus 14 for that game. So anyway, the average SEC win was 11.7. So it shows that they were beating higher seeds. And then you do the exact opposite. You subtract 10 for losses, but then you factor in the seeding, and it's only 7.1, which again means that they were losing to higher seeds. So the SEC going 11-11, that you can take it on face value, or you can factor in the seedings, and the losses and the wins are a little bit more understandable for the conference. How do you think the conference performed? Just forgetting all this, just your perception on the way the conference performed outside of the league this past year.
I think it performed rather well, Mark. You had a lot of high-profile games. You had a lot of tough competitive matchups. You brought up the Alabama, West Virginia one. You brought up LSU, Wisconsin. I thought the SEC was prepared for these games, but you have to give a lot of these other teams in the Power 5 a lot of credit for also preparing their ball clubs to face the SEC. So overall, I felt like the conference put a lot out there and left it all on the field. But as I mentioned, give the Big 10, the Big 12, the Pac-12, the ACC, a lot of credit for getting their kids coached up, getting them ready to play on any given Saturday. Because as Joe Lisi mentioned, college football is a parity. Anybody can get beat on any given day, and if you do not bring your A game, then that's going to be very difficult for you. So I give the SEC credit, it came to play, but also the other conferences didn't shy away from competition.
All right, let's head to the headlines, Stephen M. Lane Kiffin considering going to San Francisco. Fill us in on what that's all about.
Well, the San Francisco 49ers have seen the production that Lane Kiffin has brought to Alabama this past season. 36.9 points per game Alabama scored in its first year under Kiffin. That's the third most in Alabama history since 2000. Kiffin's 484.5 yards per game that he got with Alabama is the most the Crimson Tide has scored, most the Crimson Tide has generated offensively since 2000. Lane Kiffin's been in the NFL before as a head coach from 2007 to 2008 with the Oakland Raiders. It did not pan out. As we all know, the 49ers parted ways with former head coach Jim Harbaugh. Harbaugh now the head coach of Michigan. So San Francisco wants to get a new face in for an offensive paralysis. They do return Colin Kaepernick. Frank Gore is coming back. You have guys like Vernon Davis and Anquan Bolden. So the 49ers have some pieces there offensively. They just need a coordinator to come in and really push the buttons to get that team to work. Lane Kiffin would be the ideal guy, though he did say in December that he would not leave Alabama. He mentioned it during the SEC title game against Missouri, but he would not leave Alabama. He wants to come back for this season to really help this Alabama team push for another shot at a national championship. The Crimson Tide returns so many pieces offensively back for 2015. And with Lane Kiffin back in the fold, if they can get him back in the fold, Coach Saban and company will be having meetings this week trying to see if they can get Lane Kiffin to stay in Tuscaloosa. Because if Kiffin can return, this can be a very, very explosive Alabama offense heading into 2015.
Stephen M. Smith joins us from touchdownalabama.net. Please follow him on Twitter as well. He's involved in a number of Alabama SEC-related platforms. So cranks out some great stuff just about each and every day. What makes Lane Kiffin so good? He comes to Alabama. He works with a new quarterback situation. On the surface, it just looked like he just rejuvenated that offense.
He really did, and he didn't completely change it. He added some wrinkles, but what he brought is he brought a certain sense of confidence, a certain sense of style and swagger to this Alabama offense this season. And it's not rocket science. And Lane Kiffin basically gets the ball to playmakers in space and allows them to go to work. We saw the production in Southern California from 2001 to 2006 when Lane Kiffin had guys like Steve Smith, Dwayne Jarrett, Reggie Bush, Lindell White, Matt Leinart, John David Booty, Carson Palmer. We saw what he was able to put together with those USC offenses that put up almost 600 yards per game and almost 50 points a game and had a passer rating of 142.8 that was tops in the Pac-10 during that 6-year period from 2001 to 2006. We saw what he did as a head coach at USC, making Matt Barkley a 3,000-yard passer, taking a running back like Curtis McNeil and making him a 1,000-yard rusher. And then he had receivers like Robert Wood and Marquise Lee to both go over 1,000 yards. Marquise Lee was Lane Kiffin's first Fred Biletnikoff Award winner in 2012. So the proof is in the pudding when it comes down to Lane Kiffin. Is the fact that it's not over extraneous. It's getting the ball to playmakers in space, allow them to go to work, and opening up certain packages to get playmakers the football. He's balanced Alabama's running game. You saw T.J. Yeldon and Derrick Henry. They didn't go over 1,000 yards this season, but Derrick Henry, 990 yards rushing, 11 touchdowns. T.J. Yeldon, 979 yards rushing, and 11 touchdowns. So he's balanced Alabama's offense, and he just knows how to manipulate and get players the football.
We are just 16 days away from National Signing Day, what has become a national holiday for many. It's just blown up into amazing proportions. Much the catalyst has been social media, of course. The Alabama recruiting class, while it could be argued that the football squad has fallen off just a bit, and I would even argue that you can't win a national championship each and every year, and it's only been 2 years since the last national championship. And, of course, this team has been on the cusp of winning one the last 2 years. What can't be debated is Alabama's grasp on the finest talent in college football, and it appears to be the same going into this 2015 National Signing Day. So, Stephen M., can you set us up for some of those biggest and best coming in, and some of those guys that Nick Saban's fighting for right now that are leaning possibly another way that really could make this Alabama class special?
Well, Mark, this Alabama 2015 recruiting class could very well be the best that Saban's brought in, and that's some high praise, because in 2008, we remember Saban brought in Mark Ingram and Julio Jones and Marcel Darius. 2009, Alabama brought in Trent Richardson, Eddie Lacy, A.J. McCarron, Kevin Norwood. There have been some very explosive recruiting classes to come through University of Alabama, but this 2015 class very special, and more so on the offensive side of the ball than the defensive side. Normally we see Nick Saban target more of the defensive players on the defensive line and at the linebacker positions and at the defensive back positions, but Saban going after quarterbacks. You get the number one quarterback in Blake Barnett, you get the number one receiver in Calvin Ridley, you get the number one running back in Damian Harris, and 3 top 5 offensive guards. So Saban's putting up some offensive stockpiling, trying to grasp of this talent. Some big names that he's trying to go after, of course, C.C. Jefferson, defensive lineman, one of the bigger names that Nick Saban is going after on that defensive line, trying to get a rangy pass rusher to come after the quarterback. But he's brought in Desharius Flowers, who was rated as an athlete, could possibly play running back or cornerback. Alabama's recruited a lot of defensive back talent. Ronnie Harrison III coming in, Deontay Thompson coming in, 2 freshmen that can really push for some playing time at the safety position. You have Minkah Fitzpatrick coming in as a 5-star corner who can really push for some time. You have, as I mentioned, DeShazer Flowers and Bo Scarborough, 2 early enrollees that are listed as athletes, but both can play at the running back position. Alabama very stock heavy at that spot. So there are a lot of guys that have come in that boast a lot of talent, but C.C. Jefferson is one of the last of the few guys that Nick Saban really trying to bring into this class because of his aggressive style of play at the defensive line position, him being able to swim, move, rip inside, and create that leverage attacking opposing quarterbacks.
Since Nick Saban found his spot in Alabama in 2007, Les Miles, of course, going to LSU. The Tigers have been the main culprit, not necessarily the last 2 years, but prior to that, challenging Bama on the field and also on the recruiting trail. They've come up with the best recruiting classes other than Bama across the board year to year. Auburn, of course, getting back to where they believe they belong after that abysmal season a couple of years ago, getting to a national championship game, and Gus Malzahn making way on the recruiting trail with Will Muschamp on board now. Kevin Sumlin, we haven't seen it that much on the field, although he's got some people in place, and we've seen the dynamic offense. The defense should be better coming up. We see that they've got guys like Myles Garrett, who turned in a spectacular freshman season with 12 or 13 sacks. So my question for you, Stephen M., is who do you think is the real threat to Alabama in regards to the recruiting wars? LSU seems to have fallen back a little bit, but Kevin Sumlin doing some good work, and again, Auburn adds one of the best defensive minds in college football on that side of the ball.
I honestly believe that the biggest threat, it comes down to Auburn and Texas A&M, but more so Auburn, because it's not the fact that they have Gus Malzahn and now Will Muschamp. Auburn also has Lance Thomas, former Alabama linebackers coach. Lance Thomas was Alabama's outside linebackers coach last season, and Thomas has been credited to recruiting some of the best talents in Alabama with the likes of Trent Richardson, Julio Jones, Marcel Darius, Mark Barron. Lance Thomas has brought in some 5-star talent to Alabama in the seasons that he's been in Tuscaloosa, and having him at Auburn gets another solid recruiter to go along with Will Muschamp and Gus Malzahn. So I look at Auburn and Texas A&M as two schools, especially in the SEC West, that can very well challenge Alabama. We know the pull that Kevin Sumlin has, and with the addition of John Chavis to the fold, that's a lot of defensive talent that can come to Texas A&M in the coming years.
Okay, you're listening to Stephen M. Smith, Touchdown Alabama, one of our regular contributors here on the SEC in 60. Of course, we're just 16 days away from National Signing Day, and Stephen M., we will definitely need your insight, if not before, after National Signing Day, to size up this Bama recruiting class and how they rank across the board. We know it's a number one recruiting class, but whether they really won the battle on a couple key commits down the stretch and made it a special class. And we'll need your insight for that, of course.
I'm right here, Mark. Team no sleep. Right here.
Yeah, you need to fit in a nap from time to time if you can do that. So try to do that today. Get yourself a few winks.
We'll do so.
All right. Mr. Stephen M. Smith, Touchdown Alabama, never void of exuberance and energy for college football, for sports in general. Follow him on Twitter. You got to follow this guy on Twitter. And again, it's not just Alabama, it's not just the SEC, but he seems to, I think he's got eyes and ears all over the place, because he's going to fill you in on the NFL, the NBA, what's happening in other conferences, Alabama sports across the board, not just football, not just basketball. It's pretty amazing. So again, Stephen M. Smith, we always appreciate the time from him. This is the SEC in 60. We come your way every Monday. It's noon Eastern time live, 11 Central. So that's the live broadcast on Google Hangouts. If you want to catch us a little bit later, we're on YouTube. The video uploads within just a couple hours on Monday afternoon, and so we're available there. MarkRogersTV.com as well, or the podcast. So if you're working out, you're doing your chores, you're running around, you need a podcast to get you set with the SEC, get you straight on SEC football each and every week. It's the SEC in 60, so look us up on iTunes or at Podbean. Just search Mark Rogers TV or the SEC in 60. You should be able to find us there. And of course, follow us on Twitter, and we'll talk up some college football, not just the SEC. We cover the entirety of college football, and just about every day release a poll question. The most recent one would be an interesting one for you SEC fans to jump on. Urban Meyer or Nick Saban? Who's the better coach right now? Join me on Twitter. Answer the question. Urban Meyer, Nick Saban, who's the better coach right now, considering whatever you want to consider? Who's got the better players? Who's brought in the better players? Who's got the better schemes? Who's got the better psyche in dealing with 18 to 22-year-olds? Whatever your criteria, you just want to go with national championships, conference championships. Who's won in multiple places? Well, they both have a number of criteria you can work through in comparing Saban and Meyer. They are definitely at the top of the game, the top of the heap right now, with really no challengers at that level. With all the fine coaches in college football, they have definitely separated themselves. Saban for a long time, Urban Meyer in stretches, and now with Ohio State coming back to the forefront, of course, Urban Meyer doing an outstanding job there in Columbus, and it should be fun to watch between the SEC, possibly the Big Ten, almost definitely Ohio State for sure in the coming years, with USC being another player out west to keep an eye on, as they're projected to really have a breakout year under Steve Sarkisian in 2015. All right, everyone. Enjoy the recruiting wars, the social media blitz, the reality, the perception, who's going where, who's bluffing, who's got 18 commits out there but can only go to one school. It's going to be crazy over the next 16 days. We're going to be all over it here on Mark Rogers TV, so check out our videos as we talk Stanford recruiting a little bit later today, and we dive into the recruiting mess throughout college football for the next 16 days. And after that, in giving some analysis and perspective on the classes once they are signed. We enjoyed the time. We appreciate your time in checking out the SEC in 60. May God bless you. We'll catch you next time.